Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me today for my AP research presentation, The Hunger Games, Mapping Marginalization. My name is Michelle Hamad, and without further ado, let's get started with part one of my project, The Games. The Hunger Games is a dystopia series written by author Suzanne Collins in the late 2000s. With 5 installments, the series has sold over 100 million copies and has been on the New York Times bestsellers list for 385 consecutive weeks, according to Scholastic Publishers. In addition, the books have also been adapted into 4 and, in November, 5 movie adaptations through Lionsgate Media. The books themselves follow the experiences of characters in Pan Am, a futuristic dystopian United States of America that rose up out of the ashes of environmental disaster that left resources scarce and humanity's populations decimated. Pan Am itself is ringed by 12 impoverished districts that altogether serve the elite ruling class in the capital. The capital utilizes several methods to subjugate the districts. The most notable of them is, of course, the titular Hunger Games, during which 24 tributes, 1 boy and 1 girl, ages 12 to 18 from each of the 12 districts, is reaped at random to be carted off to the capital and subjected to interviews, betting, and sponsorship deals before being tossed into an arena and made to compete in the ultimate battle of physical endurance, strength, and intellect. The only catch? Only 1 tribute makes it out alive. It is this gimmick of the Hunger Games series that makes it so effective at deconstructing themes of power, oppression, and propaganda in a way that is accessible to YA audiences. Now, the books themselves can be broken down into 2 categories, the original trilogy and the prequel novels. The trilogy comprises books 1, 2, and 3, The Hunger Games, Catching Fire, and Mockingjay, and follows District 12 SEAM resident Katniss Everdeen, who is from the most impoverished part of the most impoverished district in all Pan Am. It documents her rise as she becomes victor of the 74th Hunger Games and eventually the symbol of the Second Revolution that dismantles the power of the capital and brings the Hunger Games to an end. The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes is the first prequel novel, and it follows 18-year-old Capitol resident Coriolanus Snow, who, during Katniss's time, grows up to become the president of Pan Am, making him the main antagonist of the series. This novel documents his descent into villainy, particularly through his experience mentoring District 12 tribute, Lucy Gray Baird, in whose likeness I am dressed today, to victory during the 10th Hunger Games. Sunrise on the Reaping is the second prequel novel, and it follows 16-year-old SEAM resident Hamish Abernathy, who grows up to become the mentor to Katniss Everdeen. He himself is the victor of the 50th Hunger Games, or the Second Quarter Quell, in which twice the number of tributes were reaped. Now, it was Sunrise on the Reaping that actually introduced me to the Hunger Games franchise, and I very quickly became obsessed, if you couldn't already tell. And as someone who really likes human geography and politics, I, as a reader, was very sensitive to the ways in which the seemingly deliberate world-building choices of Pan Am implicated the ways that the characters interacted with the oppressive systems that surround them. And so I began prompting myself, has anyone else studied the geography of Pan Am? And I very quickly found out the answer was no. So of course, I had to do it myself. With this gap in mind, I formulated a research question that served as the framework for the rest of my project. In what ways does geography impact patterns of oppression in the Hunger Games novels by Suzanne Collins? I predicted that there would be a pretty significant relationship, and my ultimate goal was to create a qualitative coding analysis. With this in mind, we can now commence part 2 of my project, the search for literature. Now, in order to understand the ways that geography implicates politics in Pan Am, I first need to figure out what kind of state Pan Am functioned as, because different kinds of states have different land resource policies. Now, I quickly began building a case for imperialism, which, according to JSTOR Daily, is defined as the domination of one country over another country's political, economic, and cultural system. Also, empires often exhibit periods of revolt, followed by defeat and violent repression by the colonizing power. This is exhibited in Pan Am, although the districts in the capital don't technically constitute legally separate nations, they essentially function as them. Not only because the capital has such complete domination over the districts, but also because the Hunger Games themselves are a form of violent repression in response to the Dark Days, which takes place before any of the novels and is actually a rebellion of the districts against the capital. Now, when I was analyzing sort of the geography of empire, I wanted to figure out what kind of theories were typically implemented. And I very quickly stumbled upon one, Sir Halford J. Mackinder was a British politician and geographer during the height of the British Empire, and he was a member also of the Royal Geography Society in London. He published several pieces that influenced the ways that the British Empire sort of managed its colonies, which made him the architect of British imperial geography, and also effectively considered the father of geopolitics in the modern age. He has two pieces that I found particularly helpful when designing my coding scheme: the geographical pivot of history and the scope and methods of geography. In both of these pieces, Mackinder essentially argues that while geography has implicit natural functions in an empire, it also has empire-specific ones that can be exploited by a colonizing power. According to Jerry Kearns, who is a geographer that conducted a meta-analysis of these same pieces, Mackinder argues that geography synthesizes four functions: nature, society, economics, and politics. And it was these four functions that gave rise to my four coding categories: environmental, social, economic, and political, corresponding with the colors you see for them on screen. However, there was one part of this project that was really bugging even after creating this coding scheme, and that was, what does Panem look like? It's a little bit disingenuous to have a conversation about the geography of a fictional country when you don't know what that country looks like. And unlike many other YA series of its time, The Hunger Games does not come with a fantasy in-universe map. There is one released with the movies, but I'm going by book canon, so I couldn't use that. However, I quickly found salvation in a piece called Mapping the Hunger Games, using location quotients to map the districts of Panem, written by economist Elizabeth Cross for the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. Now, Cross published location quotients for the district industries that are outlined in the novels, and a location quotient essentially shows the spatial density of where industry laborers are located. So I theorized that by using book quotes, of course, anything that we get in the canon of the novels needs to take precedent, and then supplement them with location quotients, I could get a mathematically accurate but also lore accurate. These are the figures that Cross published in her study. Now, these are only corresponding to District 1. She did publish district figures like these for each of the districts. So one of them is a bar chart, the bar graph that includes the actual numerical value of the location quotient. And then there's also a choropleth map that shows the density of the location quotients themselves. Now, with these two facets of my project in mind, the coding scheme and the map, there were a couple of things I needed to actually execute my project. So of course, I needed my books, which I have here. I also needed sticky tabs for each of the colors of my coding scheme to demarcate my data, highlighters to highlight it, and ultimately Google Sheets to input everything and do my calculations at the end. These are the steps I was going to follow. First, I would start by reading books 1 to 5 and classifying my data in accordance with the coding scheme from earlier. Then I would develop my map using the combination of book quotes and location quotients. Then I would calculate the category percentages as they appear in the coding chart. And lastly, I would take those percentages and I would plot them on my map to get a spatial distribution. Here's an example of how I classified my data. Of course, I wanted to start by keeping the sourcing information both consistent and accurate. So we have the book name and the page number, followed by the quote itself. Then, at my discretion, I occasionally utilized this notes column if I ever wanted to write down what my interpretation was. Because I was analyzing what is effectively over 1,000 pages of content, it was possible that my interpretations could change over time. So to mitigate that, I wanted to note them down. Then I categorized them into either one or multiple of my 4 categories, and then I also took the associated district number for my map later on. With all of this craziness in mind, we can get into part 4, the actual results. So in total, I extracted 231 quotes. So my original idea of geography and politics being linked definitely came out to be true. And I'm going to break those quotes down book by book. Now, starting off with book 1, The Hunger Games, I have 2 charts, first that show the instances of the categories on their own, the single category data, and then also the multi-category data that shows the relationships between one or more of the categories. Starting off with book 1, we can see that the political and environmental categories happen to take the biggest chunks, each coming around 30% each. Not only are they the most frequent on their own, they're also the most commonly associated with one another, with the environmental political category making up the largest part of the second pie chart. This is consistent across all of the trilogy. Here we see for Catching Fire, political and environmental political, and it's even more exacerbated in Mockingjay. Interestingly enough, the second prequel novel, Sunrise on the Reaping, is also more or less consistent with these same results that I got in the trilogy. Although we do see an expansion of the social category, the environmental and political categories still take up roughly 30%. And also the environmental political multi-category takes up 50% of the second chart. This, however, was in such stark contrast to what I found in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. So, in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, both the environmental and political categories take a backseat, and the social category ends up taking up over 50% of the single category data, and the environmental political multi-category only makes up about 17% of the second chart, and the two that make up the largest chunks both have a social component with environmental social and social economic. So the question, why? Why does only one book deviate so much from the rest of them? And I have two theories that I think are equally accurate. Starting off, we need to consider the social status of the characters the novels are about. Recall that the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes is about Coriolanus Snow, whereas the trilogy and Sunrise on the Reaping are about Katniss Everdeen and Haymitch Abernathy, respectively. Now, Katniss Everdeen and Haymitch are both residents of the districts. Not only that, they're residents of District 12's Seam, the poorest part of the poorest district, whereas Coriolanus is a member of the capital elite. So from this understanding, we can see that this could be due to the fact that the systems of geographic oppression interact with the characters differently. They are meant to subjugate people like Katniss and Haymitch, while affirming people like Snow's sense of superiority that derives from a regional difference. And then the second reason, which I think is equally interesting, considers the development of Anna. Now, I took the liberty of creating sort of a visual timeline so you can see when in the in-universe chronology the books take place. As you can see, the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes is way before the rest of the books, and actually takes us the closest back we get to the Dark Days, happening only 10 years after. Coriolanus, at several points during his internal monologue, actually remarks on the fact that the capital was left basically decimated by this rebellion, with many of its even elite members struggling with poverty and the infrastructure actually being destroyed in several areas. So a big theme of this novel is the investment of resources in the capital rather than in the districts. The capital doesn't have enough for itself right now. So its first priority is not going to be subjugating the districts, at least not to the extent that we see later on. Then we have this recuperation period, this 40-year period before Coriolanus' book and Haymitch's book, where Coriolanus becomes the president of Panem, and the capital is able to recover enough to begin extending its grasp over the districts. As such, we see the diversion of resources to the district's subjugation. These same resources that were used to subjugate the capital are now to recover the capital are used to subjugate the districts now. So, as we see this progression, we see that this ideology present in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes is used to justify later means of active persecution, and this ideology is actually largely rooted in regional identity. Lastly, we have the spatial distribution of my section of my project. So this is the map that I ended up creating using the book quotes and economist Elizabeth Cross's work. And for 6 of the districts, I took the most frequent category and plotted it on the map. Unfortunately, for these middle districts and District 8, I was unable to collect enough data to draw an accurate conclusion, but I see some patterns emerging in the districts I already have. Now, in the epilogue of the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, Coriolanus Snow remarks on the fact that even directly after the Dark Days, Districts 1 and 2 have the most favorable relationship with the capital. Therefore, I'm going to designate them the core of Panem and the core of the capital's control. And we see this. Because of their geographic proximity to the capital, they're able to be inculcated with the same notions of ideological superiority that affirm Snow's identity later on. And so we see the social category is the largest that shows up. This is in stark contrast to districts 3, 4, and 11, in which there is a little bit of political, but largely economic subjugation is used. These are districts that don't have the same favorable relationship with the capital, but are still under enough capital surveillance to constitute a pretty close relationship. I'm designating this the primary periphery. So we see that as the capital begins to expand its reach outward, it's not able to utilize the same ideological means of control. and so it is converted and manifests as economic control over the district industries. Lastly, we have District 12. Now, District 12 is notoriously the most neglected of the districts. They don't have either the same favorable relationship that the core has with the capital, and they don't also have the same means of active surveillance that is prevalent in the primary periphery, with Katniss actually remarking on the fact that they have a very small policing force and a lot of the laws aren't actually enforced. As such, I'm going to designate this the secondary periphery. Because of the fact that the residents of District 12 receive no aid and no intervention from the capital, they're largely left to make do with what they have. And so the environmental category is the one that shows up the most often. They are largely left to use the resources that are readily available to them. And so that is what shapes the way they interact with the systems of oppression in Panem. So therefore, we see this new understanding. Increasing geographic distance renders less capital influence and therefore different means of geographic exploitation. Now, with these three new understandings, my character analysis, temporal analysis, and spatial analysis, we can finally begin to wrap this insane project up with the finale. Now, I want to quickly address two limitations of my study. Now, the first, of course, is researcher bias. I was conducting a qualitative coding analysis, and so the data set was subject to my interpretation. It is possible that if another researcher were to attempt to replicate this study, they could come up with a different data set that would influence their results. The second being the inaccuracy of location quotients, particularly the fact that I'm using modern data. Elizabeth Cross's data set is dated to 2015. It's not explicitly told to us if the districts are historical allegories to patterns of American industry. We don't really know for sure, but if they are, there is room for a little bit of bias in this dataset. However, there is some room for how we can apply this study further on, despite the limitations. First, further research to clarify them, not only because there was maybe some bias in the dataset, but also so we can further define more concrete boundaries between the core and the two peripheries. Also so that we can potentially get more data on the remaining districts that unfortunately I was not able to include in my data set. And also, I think it would be worth applying the same study or similar means of studying empires to different empires rather than just the British Empire. For example, the Spanish Empire stands out, particularly because the encomienda system that they used for labor largely mirrors the economic subjugation that we see in the primary periphery. There's also the Roman Empire. There's a lot of Latin influence in Panem. The word panem is actually Latin for bread and comes from the form of populist control called panem et circenses. Also, the French Empire mirrors a lot of the political persecution, especially in their African colonies. And now for some long-term, real-world implications. Now, the Hunger Games was really just the data set that I used to establish a relationship between geography and politics. It was really fun. But we also see that there are some actual active methods of different geographic control methods in authoritarian systems. And it depends on where you rank socially, when and how you live, and where you live in that authoritarian system. Therefore, there is a deliberate exploitation of geography that impacts politics on a more regular basis than we might have previously thought. And with that new understanding, I would like to thank you all for listening to my presentation on the geography of Panem. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and may the odds be ever in your favor. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. We're going to ask you a few questions now about your research.
So Michelle, how did you determine which results generated by your research method were most important in informing your new understanding?
So I'm actually going to go back to my map really quickly. So as you can see, as I mentioned, I used the most common, the most frequent single category. So what my goal was with this project is when I was reading literature, I actually found no similar research done on the Hunger Games or any similar series that I've read. So my goal was to establish a broad understanding of the implications of geography and politics. And also because of the missing data set, I wasn't able to, it would be a little bit disingenuous and inconsistent if I did a really deep dive on just one district as compared to the others. So in the efforts of creating a broader understanding, I only used the largest of my categories. The only problem is that for District 11, 2 of the categories were tied, so I put both of them on the map. Also, for my pie charts here, I did talk about the largest ones that came up. I didn't necessarily get so much into the specifics of the other multi-categories because I was really only focused on the broad strokes implications.
Great. So how do your findings provide directions for future research?
Yeah, so as I had mentioned at the end of the presentation, I'll scroll once it gets there. I think that this section, the application to real-world empires, is really important. Not only just empires, but I was able to at least prove that there are some methods that geography influences politics with. And a lot of that has to do, of course, with propaganda. And this ideological difference is often, especially in the core and in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, what influenced that form of geographic oppression. And in empires, but also in fascist states, ideological propaganda was often used to perpetuate authoritarian systems. And so I think it would be really worth sort of maybe not conducting a similar qualitative coding analysis, but using the same framework of Mackinder's essays to maybe sort of understand fascist states and how they may or may not mirror the Hunger Games.
Vishal,
Yes.
think back to your initial curiosity that sparked your
Yes.
inquiry. What other curiosities do you have, and how has this process prepared you to explore them?
Okay, so as I said before, I really love the Hunger Games, if you couldn't tell. So I am also very interested in one thing I didn't mention. The person that I'm dressed as, Lucy Gray Baird, is a member of an indigenous group called the Covey in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. And throughout the movies and the books, we watch that group slowly go extinct. I am also a member of an indigenous group that is slowly going extinct. My family is from occupied Kashmir, that is currently controlled by India, and the people there are slowly dying out. My connection to the Hunger Games is largely because of the fact that I see it mirror the experiences of my family. And so I would be really interested in conducting an analysis of indigenous relationships with geography, specifically through the Covey. And the most valuable skill during this project that I feel that I was able to gain was the development of the coding scheme. If I were to go back and do a specific Covey-related analysis, I would want to apply a similar coding scheme, synthesizing different sources and different theories.
Thank you.
Yeah.